me that I would go a little slower and make it easier for him. And for those of you tuning in online, by the way, or perhaps those are here, you can keep accessing our content if you've really enjoyed a sermon, or if perhaps you've missed it or would like to catch up to where we are now in Mark as we look now to finally start coming to the end of the gospel. They are all on Facebook, on our Facebook page. If you just go to facebook.com/Montebello Church, or on our YouTube channel. If you pop up YouTube and just type in the search bar Montebello Christian Fellowship, you'll see our page. You can hit the subscribe button, and you'll be notified of every new posting, which is really every single week when we post our sermon. And we also live stream on both. And if you are watching online now, especially on Facebook, and you do want this message to go out, the gospel to go out to your friends online and your families, just make sure you hit that share button now, and we'll look to keep raising awareness in our community, and perhaps the Lord will bring someone, a sinner, someone who hasn't yet met Jesus and placed their faith in him savingly, and he'll use today's message to do just that. So I invite you to turn to your Bibles now to the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 14. We're going to be looking at verses 32 to 42. I've titled this morning's sermon, Jesus, a Man of Sorrows. Follow along with me as I read, starting in verse 32. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." Going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." Read someone say that once suffering is completely accepted, it ceases, in a sense, to be suffering. And there's some truth to that, isn't it? That oftentimes, more than the suffering itself, or as much as the suffering itself, or trial, it can be the anticipation leading up to it, the waiting time, that crushes you and weighs heavy on you. The anticipation of an emotional trial, a physical suffering, spiritual, psychological. Those are some of the most intense forms of suffering in themselves. The waiting period, the anticipation of an impending trial. Think of a man on trial after days of deliberations and cross-examining and evidences, waiting, heart racing as the jurors one by one begin to stand up and announce their verdict. Think of the wife at home whose husband is on active duty in the Middle East, hoping and praying, staring at the phone, hoping that she'll never receive that call that she's been worried about and fearful of every single day since he's been gone. You think of an expectant mother and her husband in the waiting room or the doctor's office after she hasn't felt the baby move for a few days. Or the husband and wife waiting, the biopsy results. After he's been suffering from cancer for years already, suffering through the horrors of chemotherapy, radiation, almost killing him, waiting. Gone into remission? Has it spread? Am I going to have to undergo the horrible chemo and radiation again? I can't bear it again. Or is it too late? There's nothing else the doctors do. Jesus too here waits in the garden. He's waiting and anticipating the horrors of the events that lie ahead that he's been leading up to his entire life. The hour is upon him. And the anticipation of the incredible physical, spiritual, emotional anguish that he is about to endure, it almost crushes him. He says, my soul is sorrowful to the point of death. And knowing the agonies that lie ahead, he contemplates, even if just for a moment, if it's possible, because he knows all things are possible with God, that this suffering might pass from him. And we see here in the story of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, like no other place in the Gospels and in the entire New Testament, Jesus' humanity, the humanity of the God-man, who experiences the full range of human emotions more intensely than any other person who ever lived. He's greatly distressed, troubled, filled with grief, sorrowful, anxious, stressed, lonely, dejected, tested, and yes, even tempted. And yet, in spite of what he knows lies ahead, in spite of the crushing anxiety and stress that he's about to experience, and he is experiencing now in the anticipation of it, both in his body and soul, he yields to the will of the Father in perfect, humble obedience. Because he knows this is God's plan from eternity. He knows this is God's plan from eternity to rescue and to redeem sinners. There is no other way but by pouring out his life to death. So he humbly accepts and obeys. And in so doing, he serves as the highest example of humble and faithful, obedient and submission to God's will and plan for your life and mine. No matter what lies ahead, no matter how severe the prospect of suffering, no matter how great the trial, you and I must continue to trust in God and that he has a plan and a purpose in it, and humbly accept it as his will for your and for my life. The example of Jesus in the garden. Thursday evening of the Passion Week, the final night of Jesus' life on earth. Actually, it's early Friday morning by now, when the Passover went till midnight. It ended at midnight, and it ended on a somber note, as Jesus predicted that one of his 12 closest companions on earth would betray him to death. Midnight now, the Passover meal is over, and Jesus leads them now, anticipating what's ahead, to one of his favorite places on earth for solace and for prayer, the Garden of Gethsemane. He leads them there, in the final moments knowing he needs strength and he needs communion with God. And on the way there, as if the disciples aren't already sorrowful and dejected enough as we saw, they were thinking about which one of them is it going to be that's going to betray him. He says, listen, one of you will betray me, yes, but all of you will abandon me. Each and every single one of you. They can't believe it. Not I, not me, not it, surely not I. Peter stands up and says, even if the rest of them do, with the implication that he believes they all will and he's superior to them, I would never do such a thing, Jesus. I would never do something so cowardly. Are you crazy? And Jesus says, Peter, I'm telling you that this night, before the rooster crows twice, you're going to not only abandon me, but deny me 3 times, which is to say, deny that you ever even knew me. You're going to be far worse off than the rest of them. Peter doesn't believe it. No, Lord, even if I have to follow you to death, I would rather die with you than abandon or deny you. And then Mark picks up the story in verse 32 as they continue their journey to the Garden of Gethsemane, which was on the western slopes of the Mount of Olives, 2 miles east of Jerusalem by Bethany. He says in verse 32, they went to a place called Gethsemane. It's called Gethsemane it's a transliteration of the original Hebrew word, Gethsemane. That's the name of the place. And it literally means olive presses or press of olives, which makes sense, right? They're at the Mount of Olives, so we expect a lot of olive trees, a lot of olive orchards, and olive presses to press all those olives into olive oil. And we know it's a garden from John in his gospel in chapter 18, verse 1. He calls it a garden. He calls it a garden. And Jesus loved to retreat there. And he takes them there. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. Comes to the garden, he leaves the rest, and he takes just 3 of them further, deeper into the garden with him, if you will. Peter, James, and John. Why just these 3? Why just these 3? Is it because they seem to be the inner circle of the inner circle of the 12, as we've been seeing throughout Jesus' ministry, right? It was Peter, James, and John in Mark chapter 5 that alone Jesus brought with him into Jairus' house in the room where his 12-year-old daughter was dead so that they alone could witness him raising him from the dead? Or at the Mount of Transfiguration in chapter 9, it was only Peter, James, and John that he brought with him to witness Jesus as he temporarily unveiled the glory of God and unmasked himself, the human flesh that was veiling his glory and majesty. Maybe. But I think it's because of something else. You see, Peter had just claimed to be better than the rest. Peter thought he was better than the rest. Right? Even if they all fail you and abandon you, I will never do such a thing. Jesus takes it a step further. No, you're going to deny me. No, I would rather die with you. Not going to happen, Jesus. And James and John? You remember in chapter 10 when they're on the journey as Jesus finally starts to make his way towards Jerusalem in the place of his destiny? They're arguing. They come to Jesus and say, hey, make us a promise. Promise us that we're each going to sit at your right and at your left hand in your kingdom, which are the chief seats of power and prestige. Because we're better than the rest of them. I think that's why Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him. Because he's giving them a chance now to put their money where their mouth is, so to speak. To prove the faith that they've now claimed they have, the superior faith, the greater devotion than the rest of the disciples. So he says, "You three, come with me." And he takes them a little further off from the rest. And he says something to them. Words that are not found anywhere else in the Gospels about Jesus revealing the severity of the emotions and what he's experiencing. As he began to tell them, "I'm greatly distressed and troubled." And the idea behind these two words, even in the original, when you put them together, is such a severe and acute feeling of anguish and anxiety and stress, to be filled with dread, even fear, if you will. This is severe. This is an incredible admission coming from Jesus. In fact, look how he describes it in his own words. In verse 34, he says, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death." Which is to say, my soul, my entire being, the inner seat of my consciousness, everything that makes me who I am as a person, I am so pressed down and weighed by the anxiety and the dread of what's coming ahead that if you add just a little bit more to me, I'm dead. It's weighing me down, crushing me to death. And here, when his own words fail, just like he will on the cross, he reaches back to the psalmist. And in the Psalms of Lament, in Psalm 42 and 43, it's what the psalmist says, "Oh, my soul is sorrowful." This is intense. This is unlike anything Jesus has ever experienced up until now in his life. Intense. Why is Jesus experiencing this right now? What is it that has him feeling crushed to the point of death? That a little more anxiety, a little more weight, and it's over. It's the anticipation of the horrors of what lie ahead. Is it the incredibly painful and torturous flogging that he's about to undergo, which will leave 14-inch gashes all over his body from head to toe, half an inch deep, so that he's barely recognizable as human? Absolutely. Is it the 7-inch spikes that are going to be driven through his wrists and through his feet to suspend him on that cross for 6 long hours as he hangs there? Absolutely. Is it the agony of hanging there as his lungs collapse and trying to gasp for air, he has to push himself up with his feet, which are nailed to the cross, just to catch a little bit of relief as his opened up back scratches up against the rough timber? Yes. But I think it's even more than that. I think it's so much more than that. It's the anticipation that for the first time in his entire eternal existence as the Son of God, who experienced perfect love and the pleasure and the unity and the harmony and relationship with the Father and with the Spirit, for the first time, he is about to experience alienation from God. He's about to know what it feels like to be cut off and totally separated from God. To be the object of God's wrath against sin. To have the full and fiery fury of God's righteous indignation squarely upon his shoulders and executed completely upon him. For every single sin and sinner in human history. to know what it feels like for God to look at him with displeasure. And that God can't look at sin. And in fact, he's going to turn away from him. And we see that in the cry on the cross. His fear and his dread coming true when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's what terrifies him and crushes him to the point of death. He's never felt something like that before as the Son of God. And that's what it means to be the sin bearer of the world. That in that moment, when he carried the world's sin upon his shoulders on the cross, God turned away from him. And he had never experienced that. And will never experience that again. And that's crushing him. He says, remain here and watch. He's with Peter, James, and John now, a little further. Now you guys remain here and watch. I'm going to go out further and pray. And there's that theme again that we've been seeing dripping throughout the Olivet Discourse. Remember? Watch, stay awake, stay alert. To be watchful is to be faithful, is to be ready and always alert in every day of your Christian life for what lies ahead, no matter what lies ahead, especially trials and suffering and temptation. And to be watchful is to be prayerful. He's saying, stay here and watch. In verse 35. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Jesus goes further out on his own now. And because of the anguish and the agony that he's experiencing, of the terrors that lie ahead, he collapses to the ground. And he bows his face before the Father. And for the first time in his gospel, Mark actually records to us the content of Jesus' prayer. He's told us he's prayed before in Mark 1 and in Mark 6, but he never actually described what Jesus said. Here he does that. And he moves from describing it to having Jesus describe it himself in verse 36 from the third to the first person. Now it's Jesus. He says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. And that wasn't the normal posture of prayer to the Jews in that day. No, normally they would stand, in their everyday life and normal prayers, they would stand, lift their arms towards God and pray. Falling on your face before God, prostrate, was only in times of your greatest need and desperation. When you were suffering something so severe, you were begging God for your very life. And that's exactly what we see here. This is not a normal prayer. It's not the type of prayers that we're used to, right? Especially when we gather together and worship in public. We're quiet, we're appropriate, we're calm. You hear the pastoral prayer. This is not that. When the Jews fell on their face in prayer, they would be weeping and wailing, crying, shamelessly. You don't believe me? Look at what the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 5:7 about Jesus. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Loud cries and tears from Jesus? Yes. Jesus was weeping and he was wailing loudly with every fiber of his being. That's how much he was dreading what was fast approaching. There was no other way for him to come before God but like this, in desperation, in anxiety. And in fact, so terrorized was he about what lies ahead, he was crying, he was wailing, he was stressed, he was anxious, he was shaking, and he was bleeding. Luke, in his account, in chapter 22, verse 44, says that as he was anticipating this, he was shaking. It was such an intense emotional experience, he began praying more earnestly, which means more intensely, and he started to sweat great drops of blood. So severe was this experience, he was sweating blood. And that is a real medical condition, by the way. Extremely rare, so much so that only a handful of cases have been studied or reported in the 20th century. It's called hematidrosis, where what happens is you start to sweat blood. And it happens when you're under extreme pressure and stress, basically to the point, the maximum point tolerable as a human being. And your capillaries engorge, they expand, and eventually they explode. And instead of sweat coming out of your glands, blood starts coming out of your glands. That's what he was experiencing mentally, physically, psychologically, and spiritually there in the garden. Sweating blood. And perhaps that's why Luke also says in 22:43 that God sent an angel there to strengthen him. Because if he didn't, maybe he would have died from that crushing burden weighing him down of what was lying ahead, and he would have never made it to the cross and completed his mission. Would have bled to death. Jesus in the garden. And because of that incredible mental, physical, spiritual anguish, he cries out to the only one he knows can help, God. And he says, Abba, Father. Twice actually emphasizing that. Abba is that transliterated form of the Hebrew and Aramaic, Av, which means father. Father, Father. All things are possible for you. And in fact, he did just teach the disciples that in chapter 10. Remove this cup from me. And in a moment of human weakness and frailty, Jesus contemplates having his suffering pass from him. Incredible. We see his intimate bond and relationship with the Father here. Yes, he addresses his prayer. He calls him Father. And that was extraordinary in that day and age. Nobody then in Israel would pray to God and address him as Father. Not even the self-righteous Pharisees or chief priests. As good and as holy as they thought they were, they would never dream of doing something so blasphemous. To address God as Father like that was essentially to claim equality with God. But Jesus does. Jesus did. Because he knows very well his identity as the Son of God, as God. The God in heaven is his Father before he is anyone else's. We see that in not only the intense struggle, so much so that he's sweating blood, but we see his humanity in this entire story. In the emotions that he's experiencing, the spectrum of human emotions that we've all experienced, in Mark's description of him and Jesus' own words, contemplating for a moment that just maybe, if it's possible, because all things are possible for God, that this suffering would pass. It's his humanity on display, like nowhere else in the Bible. It's important for us to remember that. We so often emphasize the deity of Jesus, his divinity as the Son of God, and rightfully so. It's important. He had to be the Son of God if he was going to be the perfect substitute in the place of sinners on the cross. Yes. But he was also a man, human. And he had to have been a man, a human being, in order also to be the substitute in the place of human beings on the cross. And we need to remember that. Shocking humanity. It's shocking how human he was here, isn't it? But it's comforting for us as well. It's comforting because we know Jesus experienced the exact same sufferings, the exact same pains, the exact same terrors, the exact same anxieties, the exact same stresses, and infinitely more. Look what the writer of Hebrews says about Jesus' incredible suffering and the comfort we find in Jesus. In Hebrews 2, verses 17 to 18, he says, "Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make propitiation for the sins of the people." And here it is. "For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted." And even more poignantly, in chapter 4, verses 15 to 16, look what he says. "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. So let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need." Jesus experienced suffering in our place. Jesus knows exactly what it means to anticipate horrible trial, horrible suffering. Whatever it is you're going through, he experienced it first and a million times more prominently. And so we can come to him. He says, we can come to his throne of grace in the time of our greatest need, when we're suffering and struggling the most and we have no one else to turn to. We have a high priest who sympathizes with our weaknesses and with our trials, and who is asking us to just come to him for mercy and grace in the time of need, and he will give it to us. Because he understands more than anyone. But there's a difference between Jesus' humanity and ours. And you see that there in that second passage in Hebrews 4:15 to 16. It says, "He was tempted in every single way as we are, yet without sin." You see, Jesus' humanity was sinless. Big difference. We're born into sin. Sinners from birth. He was sinless, because his divine nature enabled him to live the perfect life of obedience to God's law while wearing and carrying a human nature. It's incredible. It's a mystery. We don't understand how that works. How is it possible that the two natures, a divine nature and a human nature, united in the person of Jesus Christ at his incarnation, and how they interacted, when and how was each in action in his life? It's a mystery. But we do know it's true. He was fully God and he was fully man. Truly God and truly man, as certain theologians call it. It's the hypostatic union. How do these two natures mix in his life? We don't have the words. We'll know when we're there on the other side of eternity. But we know he was both. He was both. He had to be both. But his humanity was sinless. And yet he was tempted. He never succumbed to temptation, absolutely not. And to be clear, even here in this passage, it's his humanity on display, not his divinity. It wasn't his divinity that was weak and trembling and dreading the horrors that lied ahead. It was his human nature. But he was tempted. We've been seeing that his whole ministry, actually. He was tempted. Do you remember in the beginning, right after his baptism, when the Holy Spirit comes upon him, the heavens open up, it comes as a dove, and the Father from heaven says, "This is my Son in whom I'm well pleased. Follow him." And then the Spirit leads him into the desert for 40 days and for 40 nights, fasting and to be tempted by the devil. Tempted by the devil. What was the devil's prerogative and purpose here? Well, you've been fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, Jesus. You're hungry. Why don't you go ahead and turn this rock to bread? Satisfy yourself. And he takes him to the highest point of the temple and says, just throw yourself off the cliff. If you're the Son of God, God will never let even your toe touch the ground and be hurt or scratched. They will come and lift you up safely. Behold, these are the kingdoms of the world. I offer you everything if you would but bend the knee and worship me. Satan never wanted Jesus to go to the cross. That was the temptation. Because he knew what Jesus would accomplish on the cross. The rescue and the ransom of sinners, the purchasing of forgiveness, salvation for the world. He didn't want that. He wanted the world to be enslaved to sin and death and hell with him. He tried to stop Jesus from the very beginning. And it continued. Do you remember after Peter's great confession in chapter 8, verse 33, where he says, "You are the Son of God, the Messiah," and Jesus unfolds for the first time his passion. He says, "Yes, I am. And I'm going to go to Jerusalem. I'm going to suffer many things, be rejected, handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and I'm going to die." And Peter says, "No, no, no, no. Over my dead body, Jesus. I will never let anything happen to you like that. You suffer and die? I don't think so." You remember what Jesus said? He said, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter, if you're saying something like that, you need to understand that you're a puppet of Satan right now. Because he's the one who wants to stop me from going to the cross. My death is God's plan, not Satan's plan. He's trying to thwart it and do everything he can to stop it. And that's what he's doing here in the garden again. Yeah, you can bet he's in the garden. This is his last-ditch, final effort, moments away, trying to get Jesus to stop him from doing what he knows will have infinite implications in all of human history. And so just like Satan was in the Garden of Eden with Adam, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane with Jesus, the new and better Adam, trying to get him to fall too. What is Jesus going to do? Is he going to succumb to temptation? Is he going to shrink away in fear? Is his anxiety, his dread, going to get the best of him? Look at the rest of verse 36. "Yet not what I will, but what you will." Jesus, in a demonstration of resolve and determination that only the Son of God can possess, he snaps out of the momentary frailty and weakness in the flesh. He says, "No, I understand. Not what I will, but what you will, Father. This was your plan from the very beginning, our plan from the foundations of the world, to rescue sinners, to purchase their salvation and forgiveness. And I will go through with it. I don't care about the horrible physical anguish that I'm about to experience. It doesn't matter that I will experience something unprecedented to me in my entire eternal existence, which is your wrath and your fury and your displeasure and being totally separated from you in that moment on the cross. I'm going to do it because it is the only way to save sinners. An incredible act of obedience. An incredible act. And it's exemplary for us too, to know that Jesus had this battle, and when he came before God in prayer, in his humanity, he struggled with the impending suffering and trial that was awaiting him. And he didn't want it. He asked for it to go away. But in the end, he accepted the will of God. And we do the same too, don't we? We ought to do the same. We have a high priest who sympathizes with us and understands that in the flesh, that is our natural inclination. Who in the world wants to hurt? Who wants to suffer? That is not a normal human understanding of suffering. Nobody looks forward to that. Nobody wants pain, right? If you do, you're a sick, twisted person. That's not normal. It hurts. And so he gets it. And we go to God in the same way, and we pray, don't we? We pray in faith. We trust him. We say, God, take this suffering away from me. I don't want this cup. I can't take this cup any longer, God. Would you please take it away from me? And yet if you can't take it away from me, if you won't take it away from me, I know all things are possible for you, but if it is your will for my life to go through this, would you give me the faith to accept it? Give me the strength and the grace I need to get through it and to trust that in so doing, you're working something in me and through me for my good and for your glory, even if I can't understand it right now. He answers that prayer. This moment here, Jesus was obedient his whole life, perfectly. But I don't think at any point in his life and ministry was his perfect obedience to the Father on greater display than here in the final moments when this would have been his last opportunity for escape. With his flesh weak, the human nature, that is, Satan doing everything he can outwardly, satanic pressure to get him to fall away, and yet he still obeys. Because he perfectly obeyed. And it's something that I think we need to remember more. That it's not just Jesus, the sinless Son of God, who needed to die the death and pay the penalty for sin in our place to save us, absolutely. But we also needed Jesus's, the Son of God, the sinless Son of God, his perfect obedience and life in our place, because we failed to obey perfectly. No one has ever kept God's law perfectly. And that's also what's attributed to us. Theologians call it Jesus' active obedience. We have his substitutionary death on the cross where he pays the penalty for sin and conquers the power of it. But we also have his life, his active obedience to God during his life given to us. We have both. And it was necessary. In fact, in that same passage we looked at earlier, in Hebrews 5:7, look what the writer of Hebrews continues to say. He says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. So we read that. And then he continues, verse 8. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Wait a second. What do you mean Jesus learned obedience? He didn't need to learn anything. He was God. He was perfectly obedient. Yes. What he's saying is, Jesus had to experience perfect obedience in his humanity, in the place of human beings, you and me, to set the example for us, to set the model for us. That's what he's saying. Paul says it this way in Philippians 2:5-8. He says, Jesus was in heaven eternally as the Son of God. He was equal with God, but he didn't hold on to it like it's something that if he let go, he would never get it back. No, he freely renounced the divine exercise of his attributes as God. He let that to aside, and he came down to earth to take on a human nature so he could nail that human nature to a cross, and he did it in obedience to God to save sinners. That's what we also get with Jesus. His death on the cross and his perfect obedience in our place. Incredible. He brushes off his human will and realigns his divine will with the Father and says, not what I will, but what you will. And then he goes back to Peter, James, and John. And you see, actually, Exhibit A. Exhibit A of why we needed Jesus to perfectly obey in our place and be perfectly faithful in our place. Here you have the cream of the crop of the 12. Okay, the 12 are the best, and these are the best of the best. And he's going to find them asleep 3 times when he asked them to watch him pray. 3 times. Jesus is trembling in prayer while they're peacefully sleeping the night away. Look at verse 37. And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Peter, didn't you just claim to be a macho man? You said you were going to follow me to death just moments ago. And you couldn't stay awake and pray for 1 hour? And you think you can follow me to the cross? I don't think so. And he tells them again, watch and pray. Which means stay awake, stay alert by praying. Praying is the way you do not enter temptation and you avoid it, you overcome it, he says here. Prayerfulness is watchfulness. Your spirit may be willing, Peter, and Peter certainly had a willing spirit, right? He was fiery, he was impulsive. His being, his emotions, his will, everything wanted to, but he's saying your flesh is weak. You're not as strong as you think you are. Ask God in prayer. Verse 39, and again he went away and prayed, and saying the same words, and again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. I know they've just had a long and luxurious dinner, right? The Passover meal, from sundown to midnight. A big meal, a lot of lamb, a lot of bread, 4 cups of wine. They're exhausted. This is after midnight now. It's probably well into the early morning, 1, 2 a.m., almost 3 a.m. I know they're tired, but for Pete's sake, we're talking about grown men here. These are grown men, sleeping like babies, with their eyes heavy. And when he came back the second time, they were so embarrassed, they didn't even know what to answer him, he says. They struggling for words, staying silent. It was embarrassing. It's embarrassing. We've been seeing how dull and how blind they've been this whole time throughout Mark's gospel, but even now, it shows how completely oblivious they are to the reality of Jesus' circumstances. His death is now this close. It's around the corner. The betrayer and the crowds are about to come at any moment, and they are sound asleep. Verse 41. And he came the third time and said to them, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand. 3 strikes and you're out. You've had enough time to sleep. You had your chance to watch and to pray and to strengthen yourselves for what's about to unfold. Now it's too late. Get up. Get up, my betrayer is at hand. Let us be going. Jesus was asleep on the boat in the stormy sea in what they thought was their trial, which was actually not a trial. And now they are asleep in the middle of an actual crisis, which is a trial for Jesus. And now Jesus' sense of urgency and command brings them up to their feet, if not to their senses. And he says, let us be going. Not going as in running away, by the way. Not at all. The idea here is, let us be going, and Jesus is about to meet his fate and his destiny on the cross head on. He's walking towards them. He's not running away. He is determined to do what he came down to earth to do. A lot of ironies in this passage. Jesus prays to be delivered from death, yet he will be delivered through death and glorified by the resurrection. And he knows that he won't be delivered from the cup, but he will be delivered into the hands of sinners. And it's ironic, too, that Jesus is delivered over by Judas to sinners, but he's also delivered by God for sinners, right? This is God's plan. Delivered into the hands of sinners by God for sinners. Incredible, profound irony here in the Garden of Gethsemane. That when Jesus feels most alienated and separated from God, he's actually the closest to fulfilling God's will. And he submits. He submits to the will of God in perfect obedience as an example for us to follow. That's what Gethsemane is. It's a prelude to Calvary. That in a valley beneath the city, Jesus here allows his soul to be crucified, as it were. And soon, in a few hours, in a hill above the city, he'll surrender his body to finally be. For you, for me, anyone